It's a pleasure being here. Thank you very much, Tatiana, for organizing a splendid, and Sergey, a splendid and engaging conference. Extended workshop. My brief is to talk about embodied cognition. I've worked very hard on this talk, trying to make it something that will reach out to you in a way that I hope is successful. And the way I'm going to do that is by really doing an extended exploration on what it means to have a body. So as an intuition pump, let's talk about the metaverse for a second. So imagine an elaborate 3D structure, a building in the metaverse, fully rendered with the appearance of all materials, forms, and dimensions. You have an avatar that sort of looks like you. You can move through space using gesture or joystick, or possibly in an XR manner by walking and reaching. You've got things watching you. You always see the world from your avatar's point of view. Compared to a physical encounter of the physical space, what's missing? So, okay, that's the trope, that's the conceit. What's missing in the metaverse as we understand it today? 1, no exit. This is what the real world has that the metaverse doesn't have. Dwell, injury, involuntary participation, sweat, physical pain, fatigue from going uphill. In the metaverse, none of that. So here's an embodiment principle that I draw from that, and it's one that people talk about, but not usually in these words, but we are embedded in the world. I think we could understand the embeddedness idea in terms of several things, one of which I call the continuity constraint. You can't jump in space and time if you have a real body. You follow trajectories. You can't be in 2 places at once. So we start out thrown into the world, and there's no exit, so you are inexorably immersed in space and time. Another principle of this embeddedness is we are closely coupled causally to the world. So our bodies react involuntarily to outside forces. We survive by making change. And we're forced to make choices, and that's the involuntary participation. An omission is still going to lead to consequences. So the implication is that we are always present and situated. Our bodies and minds are always located in space and time, and we suffer the causal consequences of that. Situated awareness, when we awake, we have an ongoing awareness of what's going on around us because we are embedded in the physical sense, embedded in a social sense, and we're embedded in cognitive environments. So as the expression goes, no matter where you are, there you are. And we can add, and right now too. So, let's go to the next one. What's missing from the metaverse? In other words, what do we have when we have a body that we don't have in the metaverse? 2, flesh, blood, brain, touch, wind, smell, gradients of smell, visceral feelings like your heartbeat, the breath, feel of the ground, force, friction and acceleration, a sense of heat, humidity. All these currently are devoid. Of course, in the future, people are going to have to design all these channels, and we can come up to some of the difficulties that they're going to have in designing all these channels, but right now, very far away. And the complexity of 3D light. You don't get that in the metaverse, the wonderful complexity of 3D light. And body scale. Embodiment principle number 2. The body shows through to cognition. So all of those things have to do with the body showing through. They're consequences of the way the body processes things. And how does it show through? Now I'm going to say a little something about science in a second. So evolution selected sensor locations. And it selected sensor locations to maximize the performance and the simplicity of the computations we need to solve problems. For instance, ears ears are located here, eyes are located there, and they're approximately orthogonal. So when I turn my head to either orient to sight or orient to sound, my ears are appropriately triangulated with respect to the point I'm gazing at. And if I hear something and I go to hear it better, my sight is triangulated to the point where the sound is coming from. You don't get that for free. Not all creatures are designed that way. There is a scientific point to this, so that the sensor arrangement does the work of pre-processing the incoming sensory stimulation, making a lot of processing unnecessary to do neuronally because we're getting it physically. There's, this invariant relation. Here's another way the body shows through. Do short and tall people represent doors, buildings, and space the same? Near and far also depends on speed, the time to impact versus the spatial distance. If you ever saw Flash, the TV program, so he goes extremely fast. What is his conception of space? Surely the world is much smaller for Flash. And then the body shows through for little people. So stairs do not afford climbing for a very small person, but they don't afford walking for a very small person, but they do afford climbing. So shape and space is registered relative to body size, strengths, and skills. The body shows through. Affordances are defined relative to the action repertoire and skills of an agent. You change the size of the hand, you can't do things you can with a big hand. So the affordances in the environment, a nice way of putting this with using tools, is if you smoke, you see ashtrays all over the place. But if you don't smoke, they're completely invisible to you. There are scientific implications of how our biology shows through. So, we are capacity limited by our body dimensions and shape, our body strength, our speed, position, and capacity of sensors, type and capacities of effectors or actuators, and our brains. We're computationally limited. We can't do the things that would require too much computation to come to an answer successfully. We have finite memory systems that restrict how we operate for reasoning and motor planning. And so, as a scientist, you must define the computational problems being solved by the perceptual systems or even by reasoning systems in a way that's constrained by our anatomy and our information systems. Our body shows through. In this case, the properties of our brain show through. Here's an actual example. In the old days of artificial intelligence, when you were designing robots, people thought, well, in order to determine the grasp that's appropriate for a particular object, you have to figure out, one, how far the object is from you, and you have to construct a representation of the 3D shape. Then, given the end state, you can figure out where the hand, you could compute how the hand has to wrap around the 3D shape. You start with the hand someplace, and you unfold, it happened to be in 7-dimensional space, a trajectory for joint movements to get the hand there, not counting all these that give you a lot more. Okay, it's quite a heavy computational problem, but of course it's not how people solve it for the most part. For instance, for an apple, to see it, all you have to know is where to hit the apple with your hand at a reasonable speed and squeeze. And because the tendons are elastic, they squeeze around and form a tight. So we don't have the it was misposed by saying we have to have the 3-dimensional shape of the object in order to compute the trajectory. That was just wrong. We don't need to compute all those joint changes. A lot of robots now operate with air, and they just squeeze the air. There are all these flexible things. I had a lot of pictures, but I haven't got time. And they just squeeze like that, and it doesn't matter what it's picking up. It just picks it up. Okay, so in this case, the operating specification of the hand is of a compliant thing. You've got to get that right. I won't go into the peg in the hole. So the implications for this: the body partly shapes the way we think, perceive, and act. Our activity space is relative to our body dimensions and capacities. We sense the world largely because of the way, how the senses have been built into our body. Where they are, their specification, the way we move them, all of those are part of the way the sensor system was designed to work. Our body capacities help to determine our fundamental computational problems. How we shape behavior is substantially built into our bodies. And to understand behavior, you need to know the underlying specifications of our actuators and sensors, as well as higher cognition. So, we're asking, what is embodied cognition? If this were a class that I was teaching, I would dwell on these things. So I wanted to mention one or two so you understand when we're talking, there's a scientific story I'm not telling for the most part that's behind it that has led to a change in science. Okay, here's another one. What's missing from the metaverse? Awe, spirit, complex acoustics. Hey, do I have sound here? Do you have sound for me? Oh no, this is like, okay, let's try this again. You hear it? How can you hear it? I don't hear it. You see it, but look at, you see it's going there. It's possible it's to do with the volume. Yeah, I'm trying to get there because I can't see the mouse. Who's hearing it? What are you talking about? Okay, there's one up there too. Let's see if these guys. Okay, exactly the same guy. Old. One is actually in Hagia Sophia, and the other is in a smaller room. And what's the difference? The acoustic structure of the space, or the acoustic atmosphere. And how do they measure the acoustic atmosphere? In terms of approximately resonance and reverberation properties. So, okay, I think I'll come to this in a minute. Here's another thing that we have in the real world that we don't have in the metaverse. In this case, it's often the cause of like being dropped or something. So you get the pure thrill. What's interesting about pure thrill is that it is non-conceptual. So we need a theory of non-conceptual content. And we can engage the world non-conceptually. Here's an example. Your knowledge of where that sound came from, that knowledge is not conceptual knowledge. Your knowledge consists in your capacity to orient to the sound, to know where it is, a set of dispositions, to turn your head. That's what the knowledge consists in, not the concept that it occurred 2 feet away from the guy standing up front. So blindfolded subjects know where, without having concepts of the space. They can always do it. That's non-indexical location. The sound's location, they have a sense of where they are, and they have a sense where the sound is relative to their own physical capacities of orienting. Okay. I guess I do want to tell you one thing about the awe. So, now, what might neuroscience do for us as architects? Well, I'm not an architect, but so what if there's an acoustic signature to awe? So what if you went to a bunch of recognized places that have a lot of spiritual presence. And you go with your computational acousticians, and what they do is they pop a few balloons and they have microphones all around, and they capture the acoustic space completely. And then they come back, and with your machine learning, you take your 20 or 30 spiritual sites, and you see if you can come up with a signature that distinguishes the ones that do have spirit in it, and the ones that don't have spirit in it. Well, it so happens that if you can identify that, you can also reproduce in 1 millisecond the acoustics, so that we could be sitting in a 10-foot room, and it sounds like, as we talk, we're in Hagia Sophia. Well, your little room might now give you a lot more spiritual feeling. So maybe we can do that. Wouldn't that be nice? All right, what's missing from the metaverse? Here, now. Where am I really? Well, okay, this is a separate question. Where am I really? So this man is in one of these, he's controlling an autonomous, in this case, creature, robot. But before that, people often are in a military establishment, controlling a sub down below, or for virtuous reasons, picking things up off the bottom of the seafloor. And what they see is on the seafloor. They're controlling actuators, and what they're moving is on the seafloor. And if you interrupt them, they think they're there. Of course, they can't possibly be there, but they feel like they're there. So do they have a distributed body? Is the pilot a distributed being? Where are they? If you wake them up over here, they're here. But when they're engaged, when they're fully immersed, they seem to be there. Of course, they can't possibly be, but they feel it. So, okay, that's one little problem. And it happens when you go into the metaverse, am I really there? But it's not sufficiently immersive. Okay, now, how about us? Where am I now in the real world? Well, we had the pleasure of hearing Kate the other day, and I'll just talk about what I understood from some of what Kate was saying, and perhaps she'll correct me if I go wrong. So I'm going to just briefly discuss with you the idea of registration. So suppose I have a map of the nearby world, and I can see some of the nearby buildings or the world, just like you do when you take out your Google Maps. To use the map, however, I have to, in the case of Google, they tell you where you are. But if you don't know where you are yet, you have to register the map. You have to orient the map so that the map is pointing out to certain places, and then you can look there, and you can look there and say, oh, I must be right over here. That's what we do. That process is called registration. It's a fundamental process for lots of things. And it's a fundamental process that the body solves. So that's how I find out where I am. In fact, we did a study of how people use maps, and you get lots of pointing, and you get lots of talking, you get orienting the map, you get all sorts of things. Those are registration activities. It's complicated, registration, because not only is it in a coordinate system, but there's a projection. Now, these are the standard map projections for South America. I'd like you to see just how insanely different they are. So what you get from a projection, on the outside, there's shape. In this case, the outside is the real shape of South America, whatever that might mean. But we think there's a real shape to it, right? Oh, don't forget, it's on a curve. But so there's a real shape out there, and inside we have to have a shape. So this would be an inside shape of the outside. We have size. All of these are giving different answers to size. They're giving different answers to shape. And then you have to figure out where you are with respect to direction and distance and scale. It's a very hard problem. Your body is solving that problem because we have projections. So the system that Kate talked about was the place, grid, and head direction systems. And what we could say about Kate's place cells is that via this continuing mapping of ourselves in relation to the perceived world as we look around, the direction The head direction system is telling us which orientation or bearing we are heading in, or our head is at least looking at, and we're building up a notion of our bearing. We have a notion of distance because we locomote, we move. Of course, the distance would be different for the big guy or the little person. And we are slowly constructing and tightening up an idea of place around here. So we're solving this problem, this registration problem, to know where we are with respect to the outside world. This is what you get in a body, but you don't get that in the metaverse. So in the metaverse, forgive, it was the quickest one I could find, would be a first-person shooter. And in the metaverse here, you have this layout. It's structured according to standard 3D principles under a projection of distance, so there's perspective and stuff. And how far are the things there? Can you really tell? So if you have no body, then you have no way of registering the visual input to create an appropriate map of distance for what are contained in the nearby world. The visual system gives us a good guess of where it is, but it's a visual sense. But then until you actually move, you don't know how accurate that is. Maybe it's 3 steps, maybe it's 9 steps. For us, our metric of distance, as Gibson would always emphasize, is tied to movement and locomotion in particular. And that informs the grid cells. I just want to say that this process of registration is another feature that arises in embodied cognition when you get instructions for how to do something, like put together an IKEA table. They always tell you to lay it out in the floor. They're helping solve the registration problem of what part, where on this instruction set, what does it refer to in the real world, and what's the relation this is supposed to have to the other piece in the real world. So in fact, there you're altering the world to make the registration problem that much easier. And I just said that. Okay. So 5. Okay, thanks. You hear that? Okay. So it's going to go on. So in the real world, we have 6 senses, counting position of the body, kinesthetic things, and you might argue there's even more. So we have sight, sound, taste, smell, the feeling of chewing, some people call in this case mouth feel. So in the real world with our body, we are, as Johanni is always telling us, we visit the world, we're encountering the world with all our senses. All our senses. And it's better with all the senses. And the fish tastes better, provably. So the fish is better on this restaurant than an identical serving of that fish inland. Okay, so architecture is essentially multisensory. It's not just multisensory, the sensory modalities interact. So, as I just said, the fish tastes better. So the sound is affecting the taste. In this case, the visual presentation of a beautiful plating affects the taste. The appreciation as well. I wouldn't like to use appreciation because appreciation is a more complex experience than taste. So it is now widely appreciated, it is now appreciated that even in early sensory processing, within a single sense, there is back channeling and communication from other senses, modulated by simultaneous attention. So if you pay no attention, they may not affect it so much, but if you do, there is substantial back chat. So you've heard this. I'm going to tell you now a different one. So Charles Spence at Oxford. Oh. No. It's bad having no mouse. Yeah, it was there for a second. I just can't see it. All right, you're going to have to take my word for it. Oh, I say. No, okay, maybe it's here. Thank you. We all want the same thing. Okay, so he takes a piece of dark chocolate, maybe 65% pure chocolate, so it's got a fair bit of sugar in it as it is. If you play this pitch, people judge it to be up to 10% sweeter. If you play the lower pitch, are you kidding me? Well, let's stop that, whatever it's doing. If you play the lower pitch, well, that was a lot lower. It's more bitter. Take my word for it. Okay, this is my favorite of all, of cross-modal interaction. So I go like this, okay? Can you hear that? Okay, so that's got a whole set of frequencies. If you apply and you filter out the high frequencies, and you just take the lower frequencies of the two hands rubbing together, your hands feel wetter and more rough. And if you filter out the low frequencies, your hands feel softer and drier, called the parchment effect. Now, we have to know if that is broadly speaking true under bigger conditions, but suppose it is. And suppose as an architect, you particularly like certain floor textures in certain places. But you don't want people to have the feel of the floor texture. You'd like it to be a much smoother floor, but you want the visual properties of that, or maybe the auditory properties as well. Okay, we're going to be regulating the auditory properties. So we can filter out or pump across different sounds right at floor level. You're going to walk across the floor, it's going to feel smoother and drier. Who doesn't want that at times? Just one of 1,000. I haven't got time to go through all the effects of breaking glass and what happens to you if that happens in your mouth. You hear the glass break and your jaw will freeze if you hear the glass break when you're using it. And chalkboard and things. There's lots of effects of these. Okay. So, what is the principle here? We face the world as a creature with all our senses, and being in the world is relentlessly multisensory. You don't get that in the metaverse right now. So, architecture, above all design disciplines, creates structures for all our senses. And we need to think through the effect on buildings, on us, for each sense. But we also need to think about the cross-modal effects of all these different sensory channels. The sum of all sensory input is different than the sum of the individual input, so experience is holistic, and there is this Aristotelian thing of unity of experience. Another one, 6, grounded meaning. So why do we feel at home in the world? I believe this is the deepest and most interesting principle of our embodied cognition. Why do we feel at home in the world? Why isn't the world strange? And why do most things feel unproblematically meaningful? Well, there's some kind of reflexive sense-making process going on. It's hard to create a scene that's hard to understand. But it's easy to show a scene that everybody intuitively understands. I say, what's this? How many know? Okay, now you do. So it's weird until I can make sense of what bodies are doing in that space, and then unproblematic. So there's something to do with how things are used by us, how they're appropriated by us, even though I can't skateboard. Now, Somebody, I'd like you to look at this person eating some kind of custard over some maybe Christmas pudding. And I said, why do they hold the spoon like that? How come you can answer that question? It makes perfect sense to you that they're holding the spoon like that. Why does it make perfect sense to you, looking at them, that they hold the spoon like that? Because, obviously, if I put myself in their shoes, that's how I would hold the spoon. But I'm not asking you to put yourself in their shoes. It immediately feels like it makes sense to us. So it's just like chewing. Chewing makes sense to you. Holding the spoon like that makes sense to you. You don't reason through it. It's natural and unproblematic and habitual. And they do it because we do it. And even if they held the spoon differently, I could still appreciate that it was all right. Okay, so I say, who's pulling and who's pushing? How hard? And what's that harness doing for them? How can you answer that question? How can you answer that question?
Embodied cognition.
Okay, and we just need to get the principles that allow us to get there. So, we could be engaging in some kind of visual reasoning, or you could have learned about this, and so you say, I know. But you know perfectly well by putting yourself in their situation about pushing and pulling, and you could infer things you've never done before. Like, most of us have never had a harness like that on, and yet you can figure out what the harness is doing. So we partially figure out the function of things by reasoning, but some of that reasoning involves an inner simulation to interpret actions. And we understand what's going on because we can simulate doing those activities ourselves. Is it easier to split a piece of paper without starting at a side, like the figure 1, or is it easier to tear on a flat surface, or is it easier in the air? How would you make that decision? This capacity to make important, judgments, to reason, it's your body's help. You know body, it's going to be hard. This is pushing toward a theory of sense-making. So, meaning the theory of meaning that comes with embodied cognition is that sensory motor action grounds meaning. When I think of this, having been trained as a philosopher who had to study a lot of logical positivism, which many of you would regard as the enemy, I always think of the principle of verification. The principle of verification said, in an absolutely opaque formulation, in case any of you know it, it said the meaning is the method of verification. But what it really meant was, if you want to know what something means, say, if I were to do this, what would happen? If I were to do that, what would happen? All these counterfactuals. So I see this cat. Now, I could describe the cat. The cat's peeking over the table. That would be a sentence. Or I can look at the cat visually, and I have, and I look at the cat, and I have also a visual proposition. I can have the thought in my mind, the cat's peeking over the table, isn't that cute? What's she up to? And, okay. Now, so the grasp of the proposition, the cat is peeking over the table, what does that consist in? These philosophers always say, what does it consist in? And the answer is this enormous collection of expectations of what would happen if I did this, if I did that, if I go like this, what will the cat do? If I look there, what will the cat do? If I close my eyes, all of those things, all of that at once constitute the meaning. And this is a very different chain. This is a very different theory of meaning than historically was the case. Maybe Victoria will explain a little bit about this visual motor dialogue involving mirror neurons, and maybe he won't, but he might. I'm just going to push ahead and talk about grounding of language, because embodied cognition has become a theory for many people for language understanding. So I say to you, he squeezed the whole lemon over the grilled fish. Now, if you close your eyes and I say, okay, she squeezed the whole lemon over the grilled fish, many of you will have some imagery in your head. In this view, you don't need to be conscious of the imagery to activate an underlying sense of imagery. You could have motor imagery, you could have visual imagery, and the curious thing is that if you put people in a scanner, when you say this, if there was only a language box with a lexicon, meaning the word meanings, and they were confined to Chomsky's module, then why do we find activity in the vision center and in the motor center reliably? Something, well, okay, maybe not, but people push, and they find reliably present things that shouldn't have no reason to be happening. So something is going on, and the suggestion is when you understand a sentence, you're tickling these motor areas and these visual areas, and if it was in this case, maybe smell too. Okay, so reading an action sentence or viewing the action itself is thought to activate the same or nearly the same cortical regions. That you should see something or do it, and that then you should hear about it in a sentence, that's pretty surprising. But if, as we were saying, you ground meaning, the way of sense-making the world is through sensory motor action, through all that set of conditionals and stuff, then that is a grounded theory because the world is meaningful. Now I can get the same thing through language just by stimulating that same little bit of cortex that is going to give me the whole distribution of expectations. So when reading biting the peach or grasping the pen, cortical areas activated would be approximately similar to when the same participants would view videos of fruit being bitten or a pen being grasped. Quite surprising, really. I'm going to be done with it. So they're reenactments. And I told you about that already. And I told you about that. All right. What's missing from the metaverse? 7. Social engagement. Full-blooded, proxemic, sensitive social engagement. Social embedding. Sexual attraction. I'm sure there'll be plenty of sexual attraction in the metaverse, but it'll probably be crappy for quite a while. They don't have really good avatars, Full social presence. The sense of not being alone. Maybe I would get that sense of not being alone in the metaverse, and maybe that's one reason we'll be going to it. But there is a quite different sense of not being alone. Social awareness, and this thing, well, let's call full-blooded common ground. So when two conspecifics, when a dog comes into the space over there, were I a dog, something lights up immediately in my head. Even if I don't look, I'm fully aware. If you were in the room by yourself and somebody would just come around the corner, something lights up in your head. So brains are very sensitive to other conspecifics in the environment. They may be sensitive to, humans might be sensitive to dogs too, but, not the same way. So here we have 3 people working together. And why is it hard to imagine a robot in place of one of these humans? Well, what we get from the humans inside that little social niche that they have created is they have, in virtue of their closeness, shared experience, because they share a common form of life, as Wittgenstein used to say. They share emotions, they share valuations, they share sensory motor engagement of the space. It's a joint activity space. They share epistemic states, they share valuation states, they share rhythm, and they share peripersonal space, which I won't talk about just yet. So this is part of a beautiful film on the importance of rhythm to life, and I'm going to let it go even though I don't have enough time. And as you know, if you get the rhythm right, you can interleave actions much better, more precisely, faster. The body has a rhythm, a natural rhythm. You can change it, but there's always Okay, and there's more, but I can't. Okay. So what has been noticed when we do studies that involve some scanning or activity is that joint activity changes the mutual representation of space. In this case, it's an overlapping of peripersonal space, which I'll briefly mention, but here it's related to shaking hands. So this principle, let's call it social engagement. I talk about it somewhere. So what's missing from the metaverse? Furrowed brows, looking up and the feeling of verticality, the Gibsonian estimation of distance, peripersonal space, the feeling of falling, texture via feel, and this is one of the things I really want to mention now. There is not just one environment that you are in. You are never in one environment. This is one conception of environment as niche. So for biologists, the niche is distinguished from the habitat. The habitat is that little region on the beach, toward the end of it. But each bird here has her own niche. She does her feeding there. There's a little interaction between them, as one goes in and kicks up the dust for the other, and it's a wish it wouldn't, and so on. There's interaction between these niches, but the niches are well-defined creations, and they're in a dynamic tension. Okay, that's one notion. Another notion is geometric space, and we get that in the 3D modeling tools. Well, if it's 3D space, it's got to be defined relative to a metric, and simple geometric spaces are isotropic. That means if it's 2 meters over here, it's 2 meters over there. The 2 meters are the same 2 meters. They don't get bigger, they don't get, the yardstick does not change in size. But that's not true for humans. As all good humanists will tell you, the measure of all things. So, space within reach is not the same as space beyond reach. It's not represented the same, it's not treated the same. Yeah. So peripersonal space we call reachable space. Just outside of reach is, focal extrapersonal space or extrapersonal space. And if you have to walk out there, it's more ambient extrapersonal space. And these things have been very intensely studied. There's peri-hand space, there's peri-head space, there's a lot of peri-spaces around there. Here's something, okay. So how do we know? Why do you need peripersonal space? So the space within reach is primarily encoded in terms of motor system. And there's associative cortex so that the visual system depends on the motor idea of how far something is. So if an insect comes somewhere, within your peripersonal space, how is it you know whether you can reach it or not? When to go for it? And we're pretty precise about that. And all sorts of things. So we're getting visual sound localization in terms of whether it's reachable or not and how far I have to move my joints. So this is very interesting and precise. And it turns out that that sound, along with many others, when that sound enters the peripersonal space where you could whack the mosquito, the sensitivity of the skin jumps up as if it's going to make a beeline for you and you won't have long to get it. So the sensitivity jumps up very precisely when it enters into. So sound localization is accurate like that, but must also be tied to motor localization. Tools extend our reach. Won't talk about it. And in the near future, it was 3 years ago already, I organized a conference on in-body, on-body, near-body sensors and actuators. It's not going to be long before a lot of us have that stuff. What's that going to do for space? And then there is space as task environment. I spent much of my career thinking about space as task environment. For this guy, little one, probably very good at chess, he is not thinking about the world the same way as the actual distances involved in the world on the table. It's a task environment. His concern is where can I move them and what's going to happen. So a task environment, almost done, is defined as a system of choice points where the agent must choose among a set of feasible actions. Feasible, this is technical terms. Feasible action is a subset of all the possible actions you could do but they're the ones you could do at that spot. So if there's a wall here, I can't extend my arm. That's not a feasible action, even though it's a possible action I could perform. It's not feasible here. And then by thinking of the world in terms of the tasks that you have to perform, which define this sort of super network on top of the space you're in, like the chess player, that structures attention, reasoning, and decision-making. So the implication is we live in many spaces. It's not represented as a homogeneous metric structure. Different people represent space differently, the big people, the little people, different capacities, and so on. I'm almost done. I just want to show you this. So this is somebody thinking with his body and his visual system and his kinesthetic system, and this is how the vast majority of modern choreographers build dance. So they give them a choreographic task. In this case, it would be probably take the furniture in this area and use it to come up with some movements. And so he's interacting with it. He can do all sorts of things you can't do in the physical world. And if you didn't see what he was doing, it would look quite different. So that's a case where he's interacting with imaginary structures. He's thinking with the body. We think with the body when we gesture, when we write on the board. We think in a variety of ways. In this case, he just multiplied two 5-digit numbers. And he did that using a mental abacus because they learned on the abacus it's faster and you slot them around, because he couldn't possibly multiply with sound images. He couldn't multiply 19,674 times. Look at how long it took me to do that. So the multiplication would take forever. You need a better representation. He uses the image representations. So he's thinking in image representations. Well, why doesn't he just think in image representations? Because by using his hands, he can think faster in the image representations. That's thinking with the body. Oh, you've got to see this. You're architects. Sure. You can watch one more time, then we're going. Okay, so you get a lot of creativity by engaging the media outside the world. Sketching by hand is one kind of medium, and the form of your hand and the objects, the tools, the pace, the variety of interactivity that you can do are all affected by your choice of medium and tools. So naturally, if you do things in a different medium, you would expect different end products, although there could be a lot of reasons for convergent evolution. I now am going to sum up. You must give me 3 minutes more, and then it's done. 1, embodied cognition is a scientific theory that emphasizes the importance of studying real people in real situations. I'm going to read it. You'll forgive me. We cannot correctly pose the physical and computational problems that humans solve unless we understand the opportunities and consequences of human cognitive and physiological design. The body shows through. 2, human multimodal interaction can be studied in a scientific manner that reveals much of what phenomenologists actually want. We want to understand what the feel of space is. We want to understand social presence. We want to understand situation awareness, visual, acoustic, haptic, and kinesthetic encounter. This is exactly what everybody wants, because embodied cognition is an effort to break the dualism of inside and outside. So if you say that the inside includes interacting with the outside, you've just broken the old story. It's not locked in the brain. 3, one way to reveal what is special about being in the world is by analyzing what's missing from interactions in the metaverse and in 3D modeling tools. And 4, there is no such thing as one environment that humans inhabit. An environment's an analytic structure, much like a niche. Hence, 3D geometric space is a tiny fraction of what designers must understand and create. And my conclusion is, although cognitive and neuroscience are still down there working hard, trying to research trying to create a research program, figuring out what a good design of a research program is that is relevant to everybody. It is a form that will allow us to discuss in a more rigorous and enlightened manner questions that we all want answered. So you got to give it a chance and engage in learned disputation. Thank you.